Colorado Territory, September 1872. The wind cut sharp off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains as Helena Lark gripped her baby tighter and trudged along the rutted trail, her boots soaked through with morning frost. Her son, Preston, whimpered weakly against her chest, skin too pale, breath too shallow. She had not heard him cry properly in 3 days. They had told her to keep moving. Every town, every ranch, every station, same words. We wish we could help, but we cannot house the sick. Some looked at Preston with pity, others with fear. Helena had stopped asking questions. She just packed up and walked on, through the dust and the cold, with no destination left in her mind except the next stretch of earth she could put beneath her feet. Her legs gave out just before sundown. She fell to her knees in the middle of a dirt road that cut through a wide valley of scrub and golden grass, her skirts heavy with dust and her breath caught in her throat. Preston gave a weak, dry cough, and Helena rocked him, whispering, I know, baby. Just a little longer. A low sound drifted toward her hoofbeats. She turned her head. A single rider came over the rise, silhouetted against the burnt orange sky. His coat was worn, his hat pulled low, rifle strapped behind his saddle. He slowed when he saw her, reining in his horse as he approached. You all right, ma'am? He asked, voice steady but not unkind. Helena tried to stand, failed. My son is sick. We just needed to rest. I will move on. He dismounted fast, the dust barely settling around his boots before he was kneeling beside her. You have been moving too long already, he said, eyes locking on hers. You have moved far enough. She blinked at him, unsure if she heard right. My name is Nolan Keene, he said, gently brushing a strand of her hair back. And no one's moving anywhere tonight. Helena flinched as Preston gave a low cry. Nolan moved to look at the baby, his rough, calloused hand resting just above the child's cheek. He's burning up. I tried to find help, Helena whispered, her voice cracking. They all told me to leave. Well, I ain't them, Nolan said, already shrugging off his coat. There's a cabin just east of here, mine. You both are coming with me. I cannot ask that of you. You didn't. I offered. He moved quickly, cradling Preston in his arms with a gentleness Helena had not expected from someone who looked built for war. He helped her to her feet, steadying her when her knees buckled. You always ride around saving strangers? She asked, breathless. No, ma'am. Just today. They rode double on his horse. Nolan's arms braced around her, steady and warm, the baby cradled between them. His cabin came into view just as night fell, small, sturdy, smoke already rising from the chimney. He must have had a fire going before he ever saw her. Inside, he laid Preston down on a cot by the hearth and handed Helena a blanket. You need rest too. I cannot sleep. You will, after he is seen to. Nolan worked quiet and fast. He boiled water, crushed willow bark for the fever, and spooned it slow into Preston's mouth. He changed the boy's soaked clothes and wrapped him in clean blankets. Helena watched, stunned, not just because Nolan knew what to do, but because he did it like it mattered. Where's his father? Nolan asked softly as he pressed a cool cloth to Preston's brow. Dead. Shot in Kansas last winter. We were headed west when it happened. Nolan nodded once. Nothing more. Helena curled herself beside the cot, eyes locked on her son. She could not cry anymore. She had done that across 2 states. All she could do now was stay still and hold on. She must have drifted off because the next thing she knew the fire was low and Nolan was beside her holding a mug of broth. He is breathing easier, he said. She took the mug with shaking hands. Thank you. He sat across from her, arms resting on his knees. That boy means the world to you. He is all I have left. Nolan nodded, his gaze steady. Then he is worth everything. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, just full. full of things unspoken: fear, exhaustion, gratitude. Helena looked at him in the firelight, at the way his eyes never left Preston, the way his hands stayed ready. "You did not have to help us," she said. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." Helena held his gaze this time. "Why?" Nolan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low and sure. "Because no one should be left behind when they are hanging on by a thread, and you have been carrying the weight of the world, barefoot and bleeding. That ends now." She felt something shift in her chest, something she had not felt in a long time. Safe. Preston stirred in his sleep, and Helena reached for him, brushing her fingers through his hair. When she looked up again, Nolan was still watching, but not just the boy this time. "Her, you should sleep," he said. "I will. If you stay close. I am not going anywhere." Helena laid down beside her son, and Nolan moved to the chair by the fire. Before her eyes closed, she whispered, "They all told me to keep moving." His voice came warm through the dark. "Well, you found the one man who says different." That night, for the first time in weeks, Helena slept without fear. And Nolan sat by the fire, watching over both of them, already knowing deep down he would never let her walk alone again. Morning broke slow and pale, light slipping in through the warped planks of the cabin's small window. Helena stirred on the floor beside Preston, her back stiff, but her son's breathing steady and deep. His fever had eased. She could feel it in the calm of his limbs, in the warmth that no longer burned too hot through his blanket. She sat up quietly, folding the edge of the quilt around him, and looked toward the hearth. Nolan was there, crouched low, coaxing the fire back to life with a bundle of pine needles and kindling. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and faint ash smudged one cheek. He hadn't shaved. The stubble along his jaw caught the light when he turned his head. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. He didn't look up. "Didn't want to." She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her skirt. "I'll make the coffee." "Already did." He nodded toward the table. A tin mug steamed beside a plate holding 2 browned biscuits and a strip of smoked pork. Helena stared at it, then at him. "I had flour," he said, finally meeting her eyes, "and hands to use it." She sat down, hunger catching up to her now that fear had loosened its grip. The biscuit flaked apart beneath her fingers. She ate in silence while Nolan fed a few more logs to the fire, then rose and crossed to the door, pulling it open with a quiet creak. "Snow's coming," he said after a moment. Helena looked up sharply. "In September." Higher grounds already white. "Cold's creeping down." She glanced at Preston, still asleep. "We can't travel in snow." "You're not going to." She rested her hands on the edge of the table. "You don't know me." "I know enough." She opened her mouth, but something in his expression stopped her. Not pity, not insistence. Just quiet certainty, like he'd already made peace with what he'd decided. Nolan stepped out and she followed, squinting at the gray sky. The land stretched wide around them, hills folding into the distance, the grass brittle and already touched with frost. A small corral sat off to the left, a single mare nosing at a half-empty trough. Beyond it, a creek ribboned through a patch of cottonwoods, their leaves yellow and trembling. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "By choice." "So you say." He picked up the water bucket leaning against the side of the cabin. "You think I got run off?" "I think most men don't build themselves a life this far from town without a reason." He walked to the creek. She followed, arms crossed against the cold. They reached the bank, and he knelt to fill the bucket, hands steady in the stream. "I rode with the 2nd Colorado," he said suddenly. "After the war, I stayed in the mountains. Too many ghosts down east." Helena watched him, unsure what to say. She crouched and picked a stone from the edge of the water. It was smooth and oval, veined with rust-red streaks. She rolled it between her fingers. "I taught letters back in Emporia." she said after a pause. Couldn't read myself till I was 13. Once I did, I never wanted to stop. Nolan stood, water sloshing in the bucket. You miss it. I miss who I was when I did it. He nodded once, slow. You'll find her again. She looked up at him. Or someone else entirely. The walk back to the cabin was quiet, not heavy, just thoughtful. Inside, Preston had stirred. He blinked up at them with a rasp of breath, eyes glassy but more aware. Helena knelt beside him, smoothing his hair with careful fingers. Nolan set the bucket near the hearth and crouched beside her. Needs food if he'll take any. I've got dried apples in my satchel if they haven't gone to rot. I'll check. He rose and crossed to where her bag sat near the door. She hadn't touched it since arriving. When he returned, he handed her the pouch of apples, thumb brushing hers as she took it. Preston chewed slowly when she offered a slice, his small teeth working at it like it was the first thing he'd tasted in weeks. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Strong boy, Nolan murmured. Stubborn, she said. Like his father, Nolan didn't respond. Just settled back on his heels, gaze fixed on the child like he was measuring something he hadn't decided on yet. Helena glanced at him. You're not what I expected. He tipped his head. What were you expecting? Someone who'd see me coming and shut the door. He smiled then, faint and brief. I almost did. She raised an eyebrow. Not because of you, just habit. Easier to live quiet. And now, he didn't answer. Instead, he rose and crossed to the window. The light had shifted the edges of the sky, turning steel blue. Snow wasn't far. Helena could feel it too in her bones and blood. You'll stay, he said, not a question. I don't have means to go. Well then, he said without turning, we'll call that settled. She pulled the blanket tighter around Preston. You don't strike me as someone who makes decisions lightly. I don't. Why this one? He turned then, eyes steady on hers. Because you needed someone to stop the world from pushing you any farther, and I've got 2 hands and a roof. Seems enough to start. Helena didn't reply. But when she laid down that night, Preston curled against her side, and Nolan once again took the chair by the fire without being asked. She didn't feel like she owed the world an answer anymore. She just listened to the crackle of the logs, and the sound of a man keeping watch, not because he had to, but because he wouldn't have it any other way. 3 days passed. The cold pressed harder each morning, the ground crisp with frost before the sun crested the ridge. Helena rose early with Preston nestled against her side, his color returning, his body no longer burning with fever. He was quiet still, but his gaze followed her now, and he reached for her hand when she came near. She washed his linens in the creek while Nolan tended to the mare and hauled wood, and they moved around each other without need for explanation. There was no talk of leaving, no mention of what came next, but the days settled into a shape, and Helena began to fold herself into it without protest. On the 4th morning, she found Nolan outside splitting kindling, a worn bandana tucked into his collar. He paused mid-swing as she stepped onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. You keep a tidy fence line, she said. He looked past her toward the posts running down the hill. A man's got to mind what's his, even if it's just a crooked fence and a patch of frostbitten weeds. She stepped closer. You ever wish it was more? He leaned the axe against the chopping block. Used to. Not lately. Helena studied him, the lines at the corners of his mouth, the way his shoulders held steady even when he was still. You don't strike me as someone who gave up. I didn't, he said. I just stopped wanting what never fit. She nodded. I understand that. He met her gaze. Do you? I tried to make myself smaller for years, to fit where I didn't belong. When I married, I thought I'd found my place, but I was only ever a guest in someone else's life. Nolan ran a thumb along a splinter on the top rail. And now, I want something I can build with my own hands. Even if it's just a table that doesn't wobble. His mouth curved soft, not amused. I've got a table with one short leg. She lifted a brow. Well then. That evening, Helena laid Preston down early, his breathing easy in the warm room. She stayed by the fire afterward, mending her only other chemise with a needle Nolan had found in a drawer. He sat at the table, oil lamp casting gold across his forearms as he worked a strip of leather into a new bridle strap. She kept her eyes on the thread. You always this quiet? He didn't pause in his stitching. Not always. She waited, then said, what makes the difference? Whether the silence is shared. Helena looked up. And is this one? He didn't look away from his hands. Feels like it. She watched him for a moment, then bent again to her work. There was something in the quiet between them, not empty, not strained. Something that felt like the space between one breath and the next. Later, when the fire had burned low, Nolan stood and crossed to the hearth. He crouched and adjusted the logs, then stayed there, one knee on the floor, eyes on the flames. My mother used to sing when the nights turned cold, he said. Not proper songs. Just half-remembered bits of Irish and prayers she stitched into lullabies. Helena folded the chemise neatly and set it in her lap. You miss her. More now than I used to. Helena touched the edge of the rocking chair with her foot. My mother died when I was 15. Told me once that a woman should always keep something of her own that no one else could take. I've been trying to figure out what that is ever since. Nolan's head turned slightly. Maybe it's not a thing. Maybe it's a place. Or a person, she said, then caught herself. But he didn't flinch. Could be. She rose then, crossing to the window, watching the stars push through the dark. I keep thinking I've run out of road, but maybe I just stopped walking it alone. Nolan stood. You're not alone now. When she turned, he was looking at her with a steadiness that made her feel like her feet were on solid ground again for the first time in months. I should rest, she said, but didn't move. He stepped closer, slow. You can. No one's chasing you now. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I know. And when she brushed past him on her way to the cot, his hand grazed hers, just long enough to make the breath catch in her throat. She lay beside her son as the fire dimmed, and Nolan took the chair again. But this time, she didn't feel guarded. She didn't feel watched. She felt kept. And in the stillness of that mountain night, wrapped in wool and cedar smoke, she began to believe that staying might be something she was allowed to do. The first snow came at dawn. It dusted the ridge like sifted flour, soft and thin but enough to hush the world. Helena stood at the cabin's threshold, arms wrapped around herself, watching the flakes gather on bare branches and the roof's edge. The air held that raw edge that bit through wool, but she didn't pull her shawl tighter. Her breath showed in short clouds, but she stayed still. Behind her, Preston slept warm, curled beneath two quilts. Nolan had left before first light to check the trap line, his rifle slung across his back, a tin lantern swinging from his saddle horn. He'd left without waking her, but the kettle had been filled and set by the hearth, and a note scratched onto the table in charcoal. Back by breakfast. She ran her fingers along the doorframe. The wood was old, notched with years, but it held. By the time Nolan returned, the snow had thickened into a quiet curtain, and Helena had a pan of cornmeal mush simmering low on the stove. Preston stirred as the door creaked open, and Nolan stepped inside, brushing snow from his hat and shoulders. He carried a brace of rabbits and a rolled leather pouch. Caught these near the south ridge, he said, setting them on the table. Something's been sniffing around the traps. Might be a lone fox. Helena ladled mush into a bowl. You think it's hungry or just bold? Both. Cold makes beasts reckless. She handed him the bowl, her fingers brushing his for a moment longer than necessary. Then we'll just have to be smarter than the fox. He pulled out a chair and sat without removing his coat. "You always talk like you've got a plan." "I don't. But I like the sound of one." He looked at her over the rim of the bowl. "What would it be if you had your way?" She leaned against the table, arms crossed. "A warm room, a place for Preston to run come spring, a life that doesn't feel borrowed." Nolan set the bowl down. "Sounds like a map worth drawing." After breakfast, Helena bundled Preston and carried him to the porch. He blinked at the snow, reaching one small hand out toward the falling flakes. His fingers curled and uncurled in her shawl. "He hasn't seen snow," she said. "Not like this." Nolan joined them, leaning against the rail. "He'll know it well before winter's done." She pressed her cheek to Preston's head. "I don't think I can leave." "You don't have to, I mean it," she said. "I don't want to leave." Nolan looked out over the hills, snow settling into the folds of the land. "Then don't." She turned toward him. "It's not just the weather keeping us here, it's you." He met her eyes, quiet and clear. "I know." She didn't speak for a long moment. "Then, why didn't you turn me away that first night?" He rested his elbows on the rail. "Because I saw you kneeling in that road, holding him like the world could take him if you blinked, and I've seen too much of the world to let it win like that." Helena looked down. "I thought you were just being kind." "I was. But not only that." She nodded slowly, understanding settling like snow on the roof, soft, certain, and impossible to ignore. That afternoon, while Preston napped, Nolan showed her how to patch the chimney's seam with clay from the creek. She worked beside him in the cold, her skirt tucked into her boots, hands red and raw, but steady. He didn't offer to do it for her, just passed her the tools and showed her how to brace the stones. Later, inside, she dried her hands near the stove while he carved a new handle for the cabin's latch. The fire crackled low, and neither of them filled the silence. When dusk thickened, and the first coyotes called from the low hills, Helena stepped in from the porch where she'd been watching the last light touch the snow. She found Nolan at the table, the bridle strap finished and coiled neatly beside him. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone," she said. He straightened but didn't shy from the request. "I had a brother. Younger. Died in the war before I even made it to the regiment." She sat across from him, her voice soft. "I'm sorry." He had a laugh like a river, loud and fast, hard to stop once it started. Helena watched him, the way his hands folded on the table. "You think he would have liked it here?" Nolan nodded. "He would have made a mess of it, but he'd have loved it." She leaned in slightly. "You ever think about starting something again? Something not just for surviving?" His eyes found hers steady. "I didn't." "Not until you." She didn't answer, not with words. She reached across the table, laying her hand over his. He didn't move, didn't speak, just turned his palm to meet hers completely. The fire wore low, and Preston stirred just once in the cot. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside, something else had begun to root. Not sudden, not loud, but certain. By the time they stood to tend the fire again, Helena knew she would never walk another winter road alone. And Nolan, without needing to say it, had already chosen to walk beside her for as long as snow would fall. And long after it melted, by mid-October, the snow packed firm in shaded places, but the sun still lingered warm enough some days to melt it off the south-facing slope. Nolan had built a sled from pine boards and old harness straps, and when Preston was well enough to sit up for long stretches, Helena bundled him in quilts and pulled him in slow circles through the clearing, while Nolan mended the lean-to roof. Preston's laugh, thin but sure, traveled through the trees and settled like balm in the space between them. That same afternoon, Nolan took Helena up toward the stand of blue spruce at the edge of the ridge. The walk was steep, the ground soft with thawed needles, but she kept pace without complaint, her breath visible in short clouds. He carried 2 shovels and a small sack slung over one shoulder. She didn't ask what they were for until they reached a bend in the trail where the trees opened wide and the land fell away into a view that stretched clear to the far range. "This where you come when you don't want to talk?" she asked. He set the sack down gently. "This is where I come when I want to think." She turned slowly, taking in the view. "It's beautiful." He knelt, pulled the sack open, and took out a small box. Inside were seeds wrapped in cotton and tied with string. "I cleared this patch last spring, figured I'd plant come summer. Never got around to it." She stepped closer, kneeling beside him. "What are they?" "Corn, beans, a few squash seeds, nothing fancy." Helena brushed the soil with her fingertips. "You want to try again?" He looked at her, not answering right away. "Then, with you?" "Yes." She didn't turn away. "Then let's plant it." They worked side by side, breaking the soil with slow swings, the wind tugging at her shawl, his coat hanging open. When they finished, she pressed one palm flat to the earth. "You ever think about more?" she asked. He brushed dirt from his hands. "More what?" "More than just surviving from one season to the next. I mean, a life that's shared." He reached for her hand, his grip firm and warm. "I've been thinking about that every day since I found you in the road." She swallowed. "You haven't said. Didn't want to speak of things before you were ready to hear them." She laced her fingers through his. "I'm listening now." Back at the cabin, she found Preston asleep, cheeks pink from cold and contentment. She tucked him in gently, then sat at the edge of the cot, watching him breathe. Nolan came to stand beside her, one hand resting on the back of her chair. "He's strong," he said. "He is," she whispered. "So much more than he should have to be. He won't have to be alone in it anymore." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "Neither will I." He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a narrow silver band. "It's not much. It's more than enough." She stood, and he slipped it over her finger, his hand steady, his face unreadable except for the softness in his eyes. "I want to build something with you," he said. "More than just fences and firewood." She nodded. "Then let's start." They married before the first hard freeze. An old preacher came up from the valley settlement, riding a mule and carrying a Bible with its cover cracked. They stood in the clearing behind the cabin, pine boughs overhead, Preston bundled in a basket of quilts nearby. Nolan wore his cleanest shirt, Helena a faded blue dress she'd once taught in. He took her hand without hesitation, and she said her vows without her voice breaking. Afterward, they shared rabbit stew and sour biscuits, and the preacher rode off before the snow thickened again. Through the winter, they built shelves and dried meat and read by lamplight. Nolan carved a cradle from aspen, even though Preston had long outgrown one. He said it was for the next child, and Helena didn't laugh, only leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "I hope it's a girl." By February, the snow had settled into deep drifts, and firewood had to be dug from beneath it, but there was peace in the work, in the shared effort. In the way Nolan kissed her temple each morning without words, and how she warmed his gloves by the stove before he stepped outside. Spring came late, but it came. They planted the corn, then beans between the stalks, squash at the base. Helena knelt in the sun, her skirts damp with fresh earth, Nolan beside her, sleeves rolled to his elbows, Preston chasing a moth through the tall grass. When the first sprouts came up, she cried. Just a little. Nolan didn't ask why. He only pressed a hand to the small of her back and stayed there, quiet and solid. She told him, one evening in May, that she was carrying another child. He stilled, then wrapped her in his arms and said, "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have." She leaned into him. "You gave us a place to stop running." They built a second room that summer, letting Preston help where he could. The boy grew brown in the sun, quick with his hands and bold in the pasture. Nolan taught him how to tie knots and sharpen a knife. Helena taught him how to spell home. Years passed, but the cabin never changed much. They added a porch, a smokehouse, a bench beneath the cottonwoods. The cradle held 3 children across its lifetime. The table Nolan first mended held every meal they ever shared. And every winter, when the snow came early, they lit a fire, pressed close under heavy quilts, and remembered the road that brought them together. They never spoke again of leaving. They didn't need to.